So not only are they great people, great activists, but I'd like each of you to speak a little bit about the work that you're doing. They're also authors and several other things. So, like I said.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Kristy Drutman. I am otherwise known on the internet as Brown Girl Green. I am a content creator focused on telling stories about environmental justice and creative solutions to the climate crisis, centering the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color from around the world. And in addition to that, I am the co-CEO of Green Jobs Board, which is a company focused on bridging the gap around recruitment and hiring in the climate space. We're focused on, making sure that BIPOC are represented and provided career pathways into the climate space, as well as just getting people excited to want to work in this field. So super happy to be here. Thanks so much.
Hi, everybody. My name is Saad, Amer. I'm with Canines for Climate. Just kidding. I made a new friend, and I was like, I think he deserves the stage more than any of us. I'm a climate justice activist and the founder of A Justice Environment, which is a social impact consultancy focusing on climate change and the just transition. I work with businesses, nonprofits, governments, and as a consultant to the United Nations on sustainability and the environment. I also, do you want to go, BB? Okay, here you go. Here you go. We'll just let him wander. I think it's great. So doing a lot of work, a lot of my research work is at the intersection between climate justice and democracy. I just published a paper at Yale this last week, which maybe we can talk about, who knows?
Yes, absolutely.
Really trying to mobilize young people and people of color to get out the vote, in addition to trying to mobilize the upper echelons of the UN, the US government, big businesses to work on climate change and sustainability. So it's great to be here with, I don't know if anyone knows that we're all actually friends. So it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, I always joke that the climate movement it's kind of a bit bittersweet because you bump into the same people all the time, so you're like, oh, we're so small, but then you're always with your friends, so it's really, really nice. I'm Tori Choi. I'm a climate justice activist and writer and organizer from Hong Kong, based in the UK. It's very nice to be in your city, so thank you for welcoming me. And I am the author of a book called It's Not Just You, which explores the intersections between mental health and climate change. And for this book, I interviewed 15 youth activists from all around the world to really gain insight to their perspectives of how they navigate mental health in a time such as now. On top of that, I mentioned that I'm an organizer. I work with a coalition of anti-fossil fuel groups in the UK. We're called Stop Rosebank, and we're trying to shut down an oil field in the United Kingdom, the largest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea. So that's something that I'm very, very glad to be a part of. And I'm also part of Earth%, which is an organization which takes money from the music industry and redistributes it to the climate justice movement. And I am their climate justice lead for that organization. And I'm also a member of Climate Live, which is a youth-led charity with groups in over 40 countries. Some of my Climate Live baddies are here, so hence the... and we harness the power of music through festivals, concerts, and engagements to drive people towards climate action.
Awesome. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Wawa. I'm a Gen Z climate activist. I've been doing this work since I was 15 years old as an organizer, and this November will make 10 years in the climate space, which is very strange. And in that time, I've worn a lot of hats as a budding environmental justice scholar activist, as now a founder and executive director of a nonprofit, and that's my day job. So I recently graduated from Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar this past fall, and now get to do my dream job full time, which is to run a nonprofit that is dedicated to addressing the pathway and retention issue in the climate sector for Black women, Black girls, and Black gender expansive folks. We're called Black Girl Environmentalist, and we're the only organization in the entire nation dedicated to that mission. So I'm super excited to be here with my friends and for this conversation.
I mean, talk about overachievement. So I'm sitting here hearing all of these incredible contributions. And the first thing I really wanted to know from you guys is, the climate, what has happened to our climate and to our planet really are issues that started well before all of you were born. You were born into, you inherited this. And what made this the issue, the cause that you felt was, for your generation, the most important thing? Start with anyone. Well, I'll start with you at the end.
Okay, well, I quite adamantly didn't really identify as an environmentalist the majority of my life. It actually wasn't until I was 19 that I called myself an environmentalist. If you remember, I said I joined climate when I was 15, so it took 4 years. And there were a number of reasons why I felt that way. I think oftentimes we talk about the climate crisis as being an ecological crisis, and it certainly is, but it's also a narrative crisis. It's also a leadership crisis. So growing up, I felt as though folks that look like me, particularly folks across the African diaspora, aren't very much represented in the way that people think about environmentalism, as well as in a lot of the activities that are associated with environmentalism and a career in that space. And so, like I said before, I didn't see myself as an environmentalist, and it's been learning more about the way that the climate crisis disproportionately impacts folks of color that has really been a defining aspect of my defining aspect for wanting to join the movement in the first place. So I'd say something that's been also interesting is understanding that the narratives that we've been told about the climate crisis haven't always been the full story. I think oftentimes at school we learn that the Industrial Revolution is like the grandfather of the climate crisis, and that's not true. The Industrial Revolution had a father. It was colonialism, imperialism, chattel slavery. So if you go back to 1860, enslaved people were the single largest financial asset in the entire United States. That's more than manufacturing and railroads combined. That doesn't even include the crops that folks were producing. Obviously, sugar, tobacco, and cotton. And so when the Industrial Revolution came about, after the abolishment of slavery, there was this tectonic economic shift that happened, very similar to the fossil fuel, tectonic shift that we need to divest. So I think when we take that history into account and understand that we actually have gone through a tectonic economic shift before and can do it again without making the same mistakes over again, that's exciting for me, and that is something that I feel like can really galvanize people.
Absolutely, thank you. Saad?
For me, I started my climate work when I was around 12. I grew up on Long Island, just yonder, and I got really passionate about conservation. I come from a very low-income background, low-income community, and worked with my high school, and ultimately my high school, we created this 100-acre land preserve out on Long Island called the Fish Thicket Land Preserve, which is still there. People still do a lot of work there, and in tandem to creating the preserve, I realized that there was so little environmental education happening within my own community, and that I was learning all of these things with my BFF/high school bio teacher, and and felt like, oh, everyone should be able to know about this. This is so special and magical once you develop that connection to nature. And so we created a program that ultimately bussed out thousands of kids from all across New York to this preserve to learn about climate change, to learn about ecology, to learn about our local ecosystem in a way that it existed before there was so much colonization of Long Island, which was indigenous land all across. And so it became such a way for me to understand my connection to the planet and people's connection to one another. As you were saying, Wawa, it also helped me access my own culture and my own history of my own people, being from South Asia and coming to understand how climate change so intensely, disproportionately impacts the region of South Asia. I've spent so much time living in Darjeeling, up in North India, in the Himalayas, doing climate research on how the monsoon rains are intensifying and obliterating the way of life there, making it impossible for people to grow food, impossible for people to travel where they need to go, leading to mass migrations out of these local villages into main cities. So just seeing these downstream effects of climate change on communities that ultimately contribute so little to the climate crisis and yet are bearing the brunt of the burden of this crisis. And so the climate crisis is an ecological crisis, it is an education crisis, it is a social justice crisis, it is an equity crisis, it is a gender crisis. It is so multifaceted that for me, I learn about all these different subject matters through the lens of climate. And so I've been working on this issue since I was like 12, 13 years old, and I'm happy that the movement has grown to include so many amazing people working on it in so many other facets as well.
Thank you. Tori?
Yeah, I actually, like Wawa, didn't really start organizing in the climate space. When I was growing up in Hong Kong, it was all about pro-democracy, and I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's not good to talk about it, but
For another
this is the
panel,
truth though. But you know, for me and for a lot of Hong Kongers, the climate crisis wasn't interpreted as the first existential threat that was happening to a lot of people in the city. And for me, that was really hard to reconcile because I did learn about the climate crisis and I kind of knew how so many of these issues would aggregate and you know, proliferate. And I really started thinking about, okay, well, if people in my city or the place that I grew up in can't necessarily get behind a cause like the climate, what are the barriers and the obstacles that are making them unable to do so? And that's when you begin to realize that the climate crisis is the result of all systems oppression crisis. It's also something that requires us to have political freedom. It requires us to make sure that there are people represented at the table who have historically been excluded and who continue to be excluded. It also makes us question the extent to which we have these systems which are completely rooted in colonial exploits, completely rooted in genocide and exploitation. And to this day, we still see these practices being continued by the fossil fuel industry, by global corporations. And for me, I've kind of been on this journey, and I'm definitely a multi-hyphenate. I have many different interests, but the fossil fuel organizing, anti-fossil fuel organizing, is definitely the thing that I focus on the most at the moment, because it is very much an intersectional issue. It is an issue that, now that I'm based in the UK, in the global north, these actions that are literally happening on my doorstep are going to have dire consequences for those who are in the global south. Stop Rosebank being the campaign that I spoke about, which is the largest undeveloped oil field in the North Sea, which its emissions would equate 28 of the lowest income countries. And that is a dire statistic, and it is a huge responsibility for the UK government, for the 5 biggest oil expanders in the world. So we have the UK, we have the US, Canada, Australia, and I'm looking at my Stop Rosebank friends. Which one's the 5th one? UK, Canada, US. Norway, that was it, yeah, Norway. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Scandinavians, they do come across as very green, which is why I forgot it. But, Rosebank is going to be opened by Equinor, which is a Norwegian state-owned oil giant. I should have known that. But yeah, so the climate crisis is an intersectional issue. I feel like, it's something that really actually any social justice organizer, whether or not they identify as a climate activist, is ultimately doing climate work. And I think those of us who do affiliate with the term climate also have a duty to make sure that people feel like they can be included in part of this movement, to feel like the work that they're doing is valid and a crucial part of the climate movement. So that's, long story short, how I got involved.
Thank you. Kristy.
Yeah, for me, my family, my mom's family is from the Philippines, and the Philippines is on the top list of climate vulnerable risk index countries in the world. Multiple typhoons, is on the front lines of the climate crisis and has experienced climate disasters within my lifetime. And so for me, climate change really felt very personal to me. Thank God, my family was not personally impacted by Typhoon Haiyan, but I remember that happening when I was in university. And just really feeling like, whoa, climate change isn't this distant thing. It's impacting people who look like me, people I care about. It's not this thing in a textbook, I'm seeing it. And I actually lived in the Philippines in 2016 and did research with indigenous elders and people on the ground, the Lumad in Mindanao. My family's from Mindanao in the southern Philippines, very much an area that's viewed as a terrorist country in the world, or a terrorist island in the world. And my family lives there, and that's usually the place I go to when I go to the Philippines. I'm in the southern Philippines, and I remember having this whole new vantage point of being in this place labeled as a terrorist site, and then actually going with quote unquote said terrorists, which are the indigenous people, to learn about what was impacting them with the climate crisis. And I remember I got to go on this immersive trip that was focused on just us as Westerners from the global north going and listening and learning about what was impacting indigenous people in the Philippines. And, there was children as young as 5 or 6 years old saying that they would die for their land and saying that so clearly, just like straight up. And I remember just like working with translators to try to understand how the drought was impacting their crops and how they were being labeled as these, terrorists for like asking for things like sacks of rice and asking for resources and protesting against the government for that and being labeled as a terrorist. And the Philippines, along with Colombia and a bunch of other countries in the global south, are the top hotspot sites for environmental land defenders being killed and murdered in the world right now. And that includes environmental journalists. And so for me, like knowing that there are people in my home country, my mother country, that are getting killed for speaking out about climate change. I remember I talked to them and I said, what can I even do? I felt so hopeless. And they said, tell people about us. Tell people that we exist. Tell people that we are dying. And I remember them being like, that is what you can do. And I remember that just changing everything for me, where it felt like all of a sudden, I have this privilege, I have this college education, my mom sacrificed everything for me being a child of an immigrant. And I was like, I need to do something about it. Full stop. It was just I'm learning about all this stuff in school, but then I'm seeing it and I'm experiencing it and it's real. And I felt such a deep obligation with the privilege and the access I have to do something about it, to raise my voice. And for me, that's a big part of my why, is thinking about my family, thinking about the people back there that I get to visit ever so often when I get to travel back there, because for me, it's they don't get that choice. They don't get that opportunity to be able to tell their story all the time, to be able to promote climate justice in these ways, because they can be killed for it. And for me, I'm what am I doing about that then? So that's one part of my bigger journey on why I do this work.
Thank you, guys. That was. I wanted to talk a little bit about climate anxiety because Tori, you wrote a book that is exactly about this specific issue, and climate.
It's great.
Absolutely.
I've read it. Fantastic.
Climate anxiety is actually, it strikes me as sort of this dichotomy of, in order to understand the climate movement, we have to have the urgency, the severity, the understanding of how big and bad the problem is, right? But in doing so, that feeling can be quite crippling. And I think all of us have probably experienced that in time. And how has your book addressed this specific issue, and what are ways that you think have been helpful?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So, as I mentioned, I interviewed 15 youth activists from all around the world. And what's really interesting in that regard is that many of them didn't actually relate to the term eco-anxiety. It's not to say it doesn't exist, it's just that I think the conversation now warrants something that is a bit broader than the term eco-anxiety, like what mental health struggles are people experiencing all around the world. And I say this because, again, I mentioned that the climate crisis might not be the first existential threat for many people who are based in the global south, black and brown and indigenous folks, but also the fact that, is it an anxiety for some people so much as just this realization and this trauma that has accrued over years from so much environmental degradation and destruction, and also the social injustices that go along with that. I think, so there are two kind of ways that I look at it. We talk about this eco-anxiety from a kind of Eurocentric perspective of we're really fearful of the future, and it can be really hard for people to address those emotions because it can lead to paralysis and disengagement and people, maybe being overly optimistic and just not really taking action at all. Those are some of the issues that we have to deal with it. And then there's the other side where there is this element of the future that doesn't really resonate with a lot of people who have lost and continue to lose at the hands of the climate crisis. And you know, a good friend of mine, Laura Munoz, she's from Colombia, which is the most dangerous place to be an environmental defender. She said to me, and I met her for the first time in Cartagena after I sailed across the Atlantic with my friend Santo, who happens to be in this room. Very cool to see you. Yeah, we didn't make it to COP25. The whole point was we were supposed to sail to the COP. We got relocated to Madrid. That was kind of awkward. Yeah, but we found ourselves in Colombia, and I met my friend Laura there, and we sat down in a cafe, and she was just like, you know, this fear that people have in the global north, this eco-anxiety, that kind of doesn't really speak to my community because I'm afraid of the police and the militia. I'm not afraid of the physical manifestations of a dying planet. Don't get me wrong, that's terrifying, but I'm afraid I'm going to be killed for marching in the streets of Bogota. And when I had that conversation with her, I realized that actually these experiences were not just unique to Colombian environmental defenders. I mean, most people of color that I spoke to interviewing in the book were very much part of this reality where they experience, say, something like solastalgia, which is the experience of almost like a grief and nostalgia of sorts when you lose somewhere that once was, whether it's cultural, environmental, or social. And that's usually affiliated with people on the front lines. So for me, that's kind of the challenge that I see when it comes to mental health and climate change narratives, is how do we broaden this discussion to not just center around people in the global north, and not just center on this kind of ambiguous feeling of anxiety. I speak a lot about anger, and my friends know that I can get quite spicy. Yeah, specifically at the fossil fuel industry. And you know, anger is kind of demonized a lot of the time, but it can come from a very, very deep place of care. And my anger is kind of what, it might surprise people, actually makes me do the stuff that I do. You know, I can't stand the idea of these oil giants getting away with what is happening. And I want to broaden that discussion, and I want to create space for those emotions that get relegated to being too contentious and like, oh, we don't want to touch that. You know, it's not something that's palatable. Whereas, you know, young people being eco-anxious is kind of a headline. It's very narrative grabbing. So that's kind of, yeah, the challenge that I see with this type of conversation.
Well, and I think it's a very valid point that you just made. Anger is justified in this situation. And sometimes 100%. It's as if, you know, that we tend to, as humans, say, like anger and anxiety and all these things, we have to flush those feelings away. Oh my God. But it's perfectly justified and understandable that anyone would feel this way. And it's like, reaction. Right, it's perfectly human to do that. And when you guys were talking about, you know, how you came up in this movement, my story is nowhere near as poignant, but I've always, since I was a child, wanted to be in spaces where I didn't think I belonged. So as a kid, I wanted to be an airline pilot. I'm a terrible driver, so be glad that I didn't do that. I'm very glad I didn't pursue that option. But because as a kid, I would see, you know, I wanted to travel. I love being on planes. And I said to my mom, I'll become, you know, at the time we called them air hostesses. And she's like, no, you could fly the plane. And so that sort of sparked that I want to be in a place where I don't see myself. I worked in the gaming industry for a long time, which there are not a lot of women, certainly not in the game development side. But then in the climate movement, I saw that as well. And so I think, Wawa, you touched upon the fact that, you know, I say this with love, but the climate movement for a long time was a little male, pale, and stale, if you will. And this is the kind of thing that we, you know, I'm so grateful. It's probably the thing that warms my heart the most being here at Climate Week. I'm seeing that change in real time and quickly. And there's not a lot of things that I've seen change that quickly in the last, you know, 3 years, 5 years, and each time it's continuing to improve. And what do you think has sparked a lot of that, especially in the Black community? Because I think it was something that really was a problem, or not a problem, but absent, and now we're seeing so much more. And is it just that we weren't listening? And is that the...
Yeah, I think it's exactly that. So I think when we're talking about Black folks and our relationship with the climate and environmental space, it's oftentimes been one where we've been silenced and kept out of the mainstream space. So technically speaking, the American environmental justice movement came about in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, where essentially there was a community, Warren County, North Carolina, that was around 95% Black. And the state of North Carolina decided to dump PCB toxins in the community. And the community stood up and galvanized. And a lot of the folks that had similarly marched in the civil rights movement decided to march in pursuit of a more healthy community by not having the PCB toxins be dumped in their communities. Unfortunately, the organizing wasn't successful in the fact that the PCB toxins were still dumped in the community, but there was a ripple effect across the United States and also internationally of folks seeing that there was actually opportunities for organizing to take place in regards to toxic waste and environmental hazards being intentionally placed in communities of color by the path of least resistance, of not necessarily having the same access to influencing political will, which is still something that we grapple with today. I mean, in the United States, we still don't even have a black woman senator right now. So in regards to whether or not people were listening, no, absolutely not. I think it's really interesting now where a lot of my mentors are environmental justice elders that have been doing this work for so long. And when they talk to me, they're like, wow, you don't understand. Like, your experience is so valid. You started when you were 15 years old in what, like 2015, 2016? We started when we were 26 years old as professors in the Deep South talking about environmental justice. And now they're in their 80s and people are suddenly turning an eye towards them, giving them funding. And so I think there is a responsibility that comes about with us as the next generation of holding that truth. Because right now, obviously, as young people, we are going to be the ones that are experiencing the impacts of what is done in this defining decade or not done. But at the same time, the work that we're doing is built off of the shoulders of so many folks that have gone unnoticed, under-resourced, exploited. And many of those folks are still around. Right. So this movement is a truly intergenerational one. And as we celebrate young people at the forefront, we have to understand that we are here because of the ones that have lifted us up. And so in regards to the responsibility aspect of moving forward, I think it's also interesting in regards to like there's this narrative of this talking point in climate of talking about doing things for our future grandchildren, like the hypothetical grandchildren that we might have. And I always didn't really relate to that. And that maybe is a reflection of me not being totally sure if I want to procreate and have children. But because when I think about the folks that I want to protect, I'm thinking about my parents. My parents are getting older. They want to move back to Kenya. My family's from Kenya. And one of the reasons why they immigrated in the first place was because they were amongst the first generation to experience now 40-year-long drought. Climate is in my DNA. That was one of the reasons why they immigrated, met, fell in love, here I am. And now they want to go back. And that drought is worse. So when I think about what I'm fighting for also the people that are still here, my elders, and the folks that got me in this movement in the first place. And I think redefining that is really important.
And I think really an extraordinary accomplishment, because to your point, they've been here all along. It's not that communities were ignoring the environmental movement or didn't care or didn't want to participate. They simply didn't get the spotlight. And that, I don't think that that's been solved by any means, but we're making progress on that. And Kristy, I wanted to talk about the Green Jobs Board because I love any job is a climate job. We say that a lot here at Futera as well. And people have asked me, well, my dad sold vacuum cleaners for a living. How is that a climate job? And so thinking about the, what these future jobs are and bringing people to the table and sort of channeling their interest in sustainability into work. And how have you seen this grow?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to like the whole purpose of this panel today about talking about burnout and talking about sustainability of this work. We have to realize that like people aren't gonna wanna be activated in climate if they can't feed their families, if they can't pay their rent on time, if they're surviving paycheck to paycheck. That's not sustainability. That's the opposite. That is scarcity, that is struggle, that is difficulty. And for those of us that grew up in immigrant households, our parents don't want us to go through that. So we probably won't end up working in sustainability or in climate because the narrative or the framing of it is that you're probably gonna struggle. But At least you're doing it for a good cause. But that can be really difficult when you're in an immigrant household. I know it was for me. And no, none of my siblings were doing this kind of work. My parents were not environmental activists. And I remember my mom just being like, there was just like deep disappointment at times. Like, if I'm being real, where it was just like, she loved that I was so passionate, and she's always been so supportive. But there was definitely times where she was just worried. It came from a place of fear of like, well, what is your future gonna look like though? Like, what is the career you're gonna build? And I remember just feeling this deep anxiety almost every single day in university, to where like I couldn't even fully sometimes enjoy college for the most part, because I was just keep thinking, am I gonna get a job at the end of this? And as much as I was passionate and I was in activism, like I'd see my other friends who came from like wealthier families, where it was like they could do these unpaid internships and like go to the mountains and go to the ocean. That's not to shame them. That's amazing that your parents could provide that. It's amazing you had a safety net, but not all of us have that. And that just came from such a deep place where I just felt so anxious all the time, and I'd feel such a weight on my shoulders. And I remember I'd go to my career counselor, even though back then, just a few years ago, like I knew I was good at media, I knew I was good at storytelling, but there was not many people, even 5 or 6 years ago, doing that work, especially people of color, doing environmental media work. But I remember going to my career counselor at UC Berkeley, one of the top universities in the world for environmental policy, talking about climate change, and I was like, hey, I want to build a career in environmental media. People looked at me like I was a crazy person. Like I was speaking 5 languages, like tongues, like what? And then they'd be like, oh, well, maybe you could like do this kind of thing and take these 5 unpaid internships. You could build up your resume to get into communications, and maybe from there you could leverage that, and then you can do this. And I was like, what the heck? You know, I just know that like this is necessary. So I built my own job. Straight up, like I ended up building my own job because no one gave me the answers, and I had to go through mentors. I had to go through coffee chats. I was in every room that had nothing to do with climate to build the skill set and build everything I needed to do to figure this out, because no one was helping me, and like no one had a roadmap for it. And I remember just like crying, like so many days of crying, just feeling so frustrated. Like I care so much about this work, but like there's no resources for me. Like, why am I even doing this? And I remember just wanting to leave. Just like, I was like, I'm so good at marketing, storytelling, I could sell anything, you know? Because I was just good at it. I learned I was really good at marketing and storytelling, like just as a talent. Like, I don't know, through the ways I talk to my friends, or the ways I like, you know, would go to random rooms and make up stories, you know, all these things. People were just like into it. So I could have used those skills anywhere, but I chose climate. And I remember just being like, why is this so hard? And I had a full CV. I did all this youth activism. I was like doing all this stuff, right? But even for me, I couldn't find a job. And I was like, imagine, I am someone who's so passionate, did all these things, has this amazing resume, and yet no resources. So I bring up all this to say that like, if that was me and I like put it all in there, right? Knew from day one I needed to get a job out of college, and I felt this anxiety and tried to get every opportunity, yet I still didn't know what I was gonna do. Imagine someone who doesn't even know where to start with any of that, or maybe that isn't their natural inclination or the thing they feel comfortable with, or they don't even know how to navigate those conversations. With all that being said, 2 summers ago in 2021, you know, after many years of successfully building Brown Girl Green as this platform, this safe space for BIPOC to feel heard in the climate space, I thought back to senior year of college at UC Berkeley, and I said, why don't I just also cut through the BS of the job market, because no one's making content about that. So then, yeah, I basically just started posting on Instagram resources. I was like, no one's doing this, I'm gonna just curate some things. And I didn't really have any expectations for it, and then it blew up. People were so excited about it. I remember 2 months later, after it being an Instagram post, this 19-year-old Southeast Asian woman, she literally messaged me and said, hey, I got my first job hired through your Instagram post. And I remember just being like, whoa. And then people just being like, you're making it so easy for me to know websites I should check out, resources, jobs I should apply to. And I was just making it as a grassroots effort. And it led to all this community-driven demand to where people were like, no, can you turn this into something? No, don't make it just an Instagram post, make it something, because this is so valuable to the community. And that's literally what I did. Me and my co-founder is my childhood best friend. Shout out to Guzman. He might come later. Anyways, we were like, let's just do this. And he comes from a tech and product background, has nothing to do with climate. We grew up in the same small town, and I brought him into climate. And we were just like, let's bring this together. I got climate, you got tech and product. Let's just do this. And yeah, this year, from an Instagram post 2 years ago, we are now a company. And that is because people believe in the mission of making it easier for people to get into climate, to make it easier, especially for Black, Indigenous, people of color to get into climate and hold their organizations accountable to address that. And so yeah, I'm really excited to announce that we just launched our new website this week for Climate Week. And it's greenjobsboard.us, you all can check it out. And I just bring all that up because I just got frustrated and I channeled that frustration into something. And Green Jobs Board is the manifestation of hopefully making that less stressful for the future generation and the current generation to navigate this. Because if you can't have a proper livelihood, you don't like your workspace, you're not going to be able to sustain yourself in this work. You're just not. So, thank you.
I can't wait until you expand to the UK.
I know, we're getting there, we're getting there.
I'm just saying.
I also, people ask me all the time, Saad, how do I get work in climate? I always just refer them to her. So it works, it really does.
So you found that there was a gap in this space, and even if it's like sometimes the best ideas are almost accidental or with an Instagram post, right? So I think it's interesting that this is titled Surviving Sustainability, which we had a hand in, but in my mind, like, we don't just want to survive it, we want to thrive, right? And so, Saad, you did, I believe you spoke already at the UN today, or earlier this week.
Yesterday, yeah.
Yes, and you've got a busy week, all of us have got busy weeks. How are you dealing with, at what point does a burnout feel for you? What are your outlets for them?
Well, this is, I think when it comes to burnout, it happens to everybody in every field. It's not just climate. It's when you go so hard and you just get so mentally exhausted with whatever you're doing. And I think the climate space is particularly prone to it because not only do you have to do the day-to-day work of whether you're a movement leader or a company or you're an author or you're a scholar or whatever it is, you have that, but then on top of it, you have that like looming climate death that might happen to us all at any point. And seeing day-to-day these crises happening all around the world, and there are some points where people are like, oh, how do you always stay so positive? How are you always so upbeat? That's not always the case. I'm not always feeling so happy and hopeful. I remember in particular, my family's from Pakistan, and last year, 1/3 of the country was underwater, right? A country that has globally contributed less than 1% of climate emissions, and yet right now is bearing the brunt of the impacts of the climate crisis. And in addition to experiencing constant floods, there are intensifying monsoon rains, as well as massive, massive droughts because of now the imbalance in the water cycle. And so there are moments like that that just break you and make you feel like this work, I'm not doing it fast enough. My community, the people that drive me and that inspire me and that have uplifted me so much, what am I doing? It's not going fast enough. And then there are moments where you expect a couple thousand people to join you in a march and 75,000 people show up. And so what gives me so much energy and strength and hope is seeing the movement, knowing that it is building. I feel we can see moment to movement and then movement to momentum and then vote to politician to policy, and we see these big fundamental infrastructural changes. And so that is what gives me hope. It's knowing that when I started this work, it was like, who's this weird brown kid in the forest? Is that Mowgli from the Jungle Book? To now seeing so many people actively engaging in the space and so many people wanting to get involved that we can even have resources for their mental health specifically, or for them to get more occupation and resource help with their careers. The movement is growing so much. In a study that I just was an author on that came out at Yale last week, which is one of the largest environmental justice surveys of the American public ever. It's part of Yale University's Climate Change in the American Mind series that they do. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that series of studies that they do. One really interesting data point that emerged was that currently less than 1% of the American public, according to this survey, is engaged in environmental campaigns. But 25% of the public is willing to be engaged in campaigns. And what that signals to me is we're just starting, right? There is room for tremendous growth within the climate crisis. So even as the crisis gets worse and the emissions rise, people are rising up to the occasion. And so there are so many opportunities to organize, to mobilize, to vote, to work, to change the system. And that's what makes me avoid burnout, is knowing that it's not just me who's doing this work, it's that it's this collective. And that if I need to take a minute to step back and have a cup of tea, someone else will take the reins and do exactly what needs to be done.
Well, and I think it's something very human that we all crave community. And we have all of these devices to keep us connected, but truly they can be isolating. And we come here, and as you mentioned, 75,000 people, a huge community shows up with a unified cause. And I think you guys mentioned, and I know you're all friends, you come to these events, you come to Climate Week, and you get to see your friends. What are one or two ways in which you have, the positives that you found from this community, and what has it given you that has kept you going? I'll start with you, Wawa. Sorry.
I mean, there's so many things I could talk about. I would say, so funny enough, Black Girl Environmentalist also started out as an Instagram page. So we started out in 2020 and officially debuted in 2021 as essentially an affinity space for Black women and Black femmes and Black non-binary folks to really see each other and find community in climate, because community is so central. And it's really been through meeting so many other BGEs and also being surrounded by really young and ambitious folks that are really tired with the way that things have been in this movement and have decided to create their own companies, or decided to be front and center at the UN, or decided to write a book because these topics and these nuances weren't resources that we had coming up in this movement. And even though we are still young, we want to make sure that, I'm like, are we all Gen Z? I don't know. But the rest of Gen Z, yeah, I'm a zillennial, so I'm like 98, so kind of
I definitely
on the cusp.
Of course.
But making sure that younger Gen Z and Gen Alpha have more resources to be better supported coming up in this movement. So it's definitely been able to have different folks to look up to be able to be audacious. Graduating from Oxford and being offered my dream job that I thought was my dream job, and thinking about how many of my Black women mentors were like, I'm leaving climate because they're like, it's ghetto in here. It's a little too much. And being like, well, we have to stay. We can't leave. This is the movement of our lives. And deciding to make a job out of creating resources for emerging climate leaders of color to find community, to have hubs in 10 different cities in the United States, to have opportunities to be placed at climate jobs that are grounded in climate justice and have that as a gateway into climate. And being able to resource people in ways that I wasn't is something that I wouldn't have been able to do if I didn't have mentors that were older than me, but also people that are the same age as me doing the things that people haven't done before. And it's been that co-inspiration that's been really, really powerful.
Well, one thing that I've noticed, lots of friends of mine, if they are getting to know me, they think that this is all I ever think about, which is kind of, but I'm like, I do have fun and I do live a whole life, right? So I think that's kind of, because we're deeply passionate and driven by that purpose, it's sometimes thought of that you can't disconnect, or there's guilt in disconnection. And I think what are ways we're gonna, like I said, it's gonna be a little bit of group therapy where we're talking about what is the best way that you guys have found to disconnect. Tori?
I mean, I love to forage. Those who know me know that I'm a mushroom gal through and through. All the mushrooms. You didn't hear it here. I love to forage. But I also love music, and I'm going to shout out my Climate Live fam who are literally right here with me. And we love music. Like, we love music. Everyone loves music, no matter what genre, you know, there's something out there for you. And it is such a powerful tool for communication as well. And I've just found myself in the intersection between music and sustainability quite a lot over the last few years, which to me is a really interesting one, because we do struggle with the climate work that we're doing. We do burn out, but then we kind of offset it a little bit by knowing that we're doing something joyful. And my friend at the front, Dominique, speaks a lot about climate joy, and she's inspired me so much to really tap into those spaces where you do get joy from the work that you're doing. And you know, on the subject of Climate Week, it's only day 2 and it is exhausting, but what we've been doing as Climate Live is tag teaming it. We have a 50-meter square pavilion in the Blue Zone at COP this year, and we've been trying to fundraise to get that, you know, covered so that, you know, folks from all around the world can use this space to drive some messaging. And I'm not going to jinx it, but I think we did get some funding this morning, which is very exciting. And you know, that's the thing, we've been really sharing this responsibility. We've been going to all of these events together. We've been tag teaming it. And I think when you work as a community and as a team, that's super important. And I know that we have a panel that's coming up. When is it again, Francis? Friday at 8 a.m., which is all about harnessing the power of music and climate. Wawa will be there too. Francis and Dominique will be there. Come listen. It will be joyful. And also, I'm just going to say, me, Francis, and Dominique, we've been keeping this a secret for a while. But we're starting a band. And we're recording our first EP in October, and we're working with the producer. We've been writing songs, singing together, jamming. And that is like something we're so excited about. And it's a fun way to kind of keep things joyful.
See, so you do other things. You have a whole thing. You have like several other jobs. Well, and I think it's interesting too, when you think about entertainment, people don't naturally associate music and climate, or even comedy and climate. We have a session on comedy as well this week at Solutions House. And I think it's, most comedy, when done well, has an air of truth to it and an air of reality to it, right? So I think it's, all of these artistic expressions are really important, and also a good way for us to help feel better about what we're doing. I also want to give a shout to there's a bunch of people online, so I'm going to pause for some audience questions as well. And one last question, I wanted to give you guys a chance to say, what are your unwind tactics?
I was just gonna say that, like, I try to incorporate a lot of fun into the work. I don't like the idea of like you need a vacation from your work. Like, you do, but like I'd rather just like make the work more enjoyable. So before I was here, I have this series called Love and Climate, and I make people go on dates and talk about climate change.
You did a speed dating thing, right?
Yes, I've been doing it. I did it in
That's
Central Park, Prospect Park. I just did it in Washington Square Park right before I came here. It was very stressful. I'm not gonna lie. Like, it wasn't like very fun at first, but then once it was there, we kind of match make. So we like bring the couples together, and then we like see like when you go on a date with the person. And it's just so fun because it allows people to be like, oh, like, what if we just brought climate to the dinner table into our relationships? And it doesn't have to be this like super scary thing. It can be another topic of discussion that like your partner could comfort you through. And like, what if we could live through that and actually cultivate our lives in a way with intention and community and connection? And for me, I'm like, okay, that feels better. And so I just wanted to plug Love and Climate because that's been my fun creative outlet in the work, where it's like I've made a project that like actually is my outlet to just like be a goofball and just like have a good time. So.
Absolutely, I love it. Sign up for Love and Climate anyway.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways to unplug. You know, I think not everything can be work, and we shouldn't, you know, I don't live to work, and I don't work to live. I work and I'm living, you know.
Wow, Shakespeare.
Work. And so, you know, I take a lot of time to just care for myself. I, have a morning ritual of just having a cup of tea every day, no news, no social media. It's just me. It's just myself in my own space existing. I spend a lot of time with friends who have nothing to do with the climate movement, and it's not what they do, it's not what they're interested. They're not like Saad the activist. They're like, hey, like, oh my God, so where should we go to dinner? Where should we do brunch? And it's just like a nice, fun vibe. I love anime and Pokemon, but the more the climate crisis worsens, you start to see these things seep into all those other spaces, right? So like climate change threatening our global supply chains for tea production. Don't love that for my morning ritual. Or even Pokemon. Do we have any Pokemon fans in the audience? Great, real ones, fantastic. For example, there's one Pokemon from the second generation named Corsola, a water-type Pokemon, that is based on a coral. And in one of the more recent Pokemon generations, there's a new version of this Pokemon Corsola called Cursola, which went from being a water type to a ghost type, a healthy pink to a sad bleached white. Wow. And its description in the Pokédex, its description in the game is that it has become bleached white as a result of global climate change.
Wow.
And so we have the climate crisis even impacting the Pokédex. I don't know what Pikachu thought was going to happen, but so it is a reminder that climate change is impacting us all, real or fictional. I think, though, it still is important to find those moments of joy and those moments of fun, those moments of liberation and community, and there are so many avenues to explore that. And I think people will see us online or talk to us and think like, oh, you only think about and do climate change. And like, yeah, I guess I'm always thinking about it, but I'm also living my life, experiencing joy, enjoying nature, just sitting and having a cup of tea. And in that you can find a sense of rootedness in yourself, because when we talk about climate action, it's so much about protecting the things that we love. And so you have to make sure that you have things that you love to protect.
Absolutely. Oh, thank you. That was great. I'd love to turn it to the audience if anyone has questions, please. Yes, Hannah.
Listen.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. My name's Hannah. I'm the co-founder of the Now Work, which is a flexible talent platform for sustainability. So we're like the Green Jobs Board partner, but for flexible freelance work. And something that we hear so often with the folks on our network who have shifted towards flexible working, it's because they were so burnt out in their 9-to-5 corporate jobs. So they have the climate anxiety, but then they also have all the anxiety and stress of being in work cultures which promote overwork and stress, and it's sustainability teams who are under-resourced and whose task at hand doesn't align with the business priorities, so they're constantly meeting closed doors. And so the thing that we are exploring is within our work culture, burnout is so often positioned as an individual failure and not a system of work culture, which is built on 20th century management models from the Industrial Revolution, which defined laborers as resources to extract value from. So my question is for all of you, how do we help shift that conversation from one of burnout being around a problem for individuals to deal with that you need to step out from work culture and go handle on your own, to actually looking at how do we shift the dominant work cultures that a lot of us are working with under, and shifting the bigger system there of how impact work specifically is actually getting done.
Thank you.
I'm going to quickly give my 2 cents because I think there's a solution to an aspect of that, and it's directly related to all of us on here because we were talking about it before. I think we were answering the question of, like, obviously talking about the positive aspects of why we do the work and what brings us joy. But the reality is, and I don't want to speak for everyone here, I am burnt out. I am burnt out. So, if I was to answer that question, I would tell you what I want to do with my time, but I don't get to do that with my time because we are under-resourced. youth-led climate organizations receive 0.76% of all climate philanthropy, and climate philanthropy is the least funded issue out there. And then if we take a step further to like Black and Indigenous youth-led organizations, that percentage, those percentages, those data points aren't even out yet. And I can tell you from my personal experience that it is very, very difficult. So the reality is that a lot of us aren't working 9 to 5s. My partner's here, so he can tell you I'm not lying. It's like you wake up, you do work, and now it's 11 p.m. and I'm still sitting there at the computer writing grants, literally begging people to give us funding to do the work that we're already doing, but like extremely burnt out, but to be able to be properly resourced so that we can love the things that we're doing, so we can love the world that we're meant to protect, right? So I would say, if you have the positionality to distribute your wealth, if you know folks that have the ability to sway a foundation or to be introduced to youth-led organizations, and particularly youth of color that are doing this work, please do so, because so many of us are on these stages and you see us online, and what you don't see is that we are really struggling and we really do need support. And support also isn't monetary as well. I think oftentimes I will get a bit intimidated about reaching out to folks for mentorship, for support as a young person navigating philanthropy, as a young person navigating running a nonprofit as my first job. And a lot of those circumstances are hard, and I can't turn to my family because they aren't from this space either. And so for folks that have been in climate and have like the networks, have the resources, reach out to young people like us, lend us like your time, whether it's advice, whether it's financial support, just do it, because even if we're not asking, we definitely do need it.
Well, and I think it's pointing out a different layer of, the anxiety, if there's anxiety or concern about, it's not just about the climate and the planet, it's also that you're working too hard. We're all working because this is an under-resourced space. So the same people who are most impacted are also under-resourced in this manner. And that's a really important point. I think we only have time for one more question from the audience, if there is. Any questions? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ellie. I am a strategist, want to be a sustainability strategist, but a strategist at an agency that's focused on experiential. And I used to work at Edelman, which was, if anyone is aware of the the office, it was really hard. That was my first job. I was aware of the fact that I wanted to work for an agency with a big name. I had learned about the trust barometer in college and was excited by the name, which was just very interesting since I was not driven by the name of brands in general. But once I got there, I learned about the role of a strategist after realizing that I couldn't be a data analyst, and was excited to have a much more active role in campaign development and be able to sort of guide the conversation or raise flags about things that happen in the space, and when we get client briefs that feel like they may be greenwashing, and be able to flag that. And unfortunately, I had worked internally and had tried to sort of create a conversation and got all the way up to the top just to be so burned out. And realized that I needed to find a new space to continue surviving. And so I made my way to New York. I'm sorry, this is like a therapy. And am back in a almost worse position. I feel like now that I have like left the space that I initially was so passionate about, I'm now working for an agency where I am trying to create an internal team, but feels understaffed or under-resourced, or I want to make the transition into a climate job in whatever capacity that looks like. And I thought that by working in a space that was adjacent, like currently in entertainment strategy, that I would be able to like find that balance, but instead I feel like I can't do my job. And so my question for you all is, realizing that there is so much importance and focus on finding ways to bring climate into your job, but also recognizing the fact that many people who work in the communication space don't have the time or educational background to make that move. I'm curious if you have any advice on how to sort of bridge that gap as a communications professional who wants to have a bigger impact in the climate space.
Quickly, just
Of course, please.
Also, I'm sorry for booing at Edelman. Just my friends at the back, my friends at the back who work for Clean Creatives, they've been running campaigns against Edelman and their links to the fossil fuel industry. So I just want to point that out. And like, by no means whatsoever is it the workers' fault. It's the CEO's fault. It's the people who are funding them. It is the people at the top. And if you're a young professional and you're trying to find your way in this world and you're like, I'm going to get into a company and I'm going to shake it up from the inside, it can be some of the most demoralizing work. And it's so hard. So I'm almost just like, hats off to you for trying to even like question these things in these companies, because that is so difficult to do when you're a young person and a young professional. On the subject of like how you can imbue that kind of climate strategy into your work, you know, many people, like including people who work at Clean Creatives, are trying to challenge these narratives about what they do in these companies. Do it in community. Like, find those people who are like-minded. Find those people who are like, I have these skills. I work in industries and with companies that have previously done some pretty shady stuff, but I really want to shake stuff up as well. Find those people, build those connections, because honestly, it's out there. It's out there, and there will be people to support you, to help you challenge these narratives that are happening in these companies, who can point you in the right direction of companies that are also doing great work. So, community, always.
And I just want to plug the Now Work, who just asked us a question about burnout, because she has their company has a lot of examples of people that have transitioned their jobs, and I'm sure they could be a good resource to connect you with some people in their network who have done freelance strategy and have tried to like build their own portfolios. So I think you should connect with her afterwards.
And like most therapy sessions, this 1 hour went by very quickly, and I feel like that's to be expected. I want to say thank you to our panelists, but I think you guys probably hear, thank you, we're so inspired, you're young activists and you're fighting the good fight. I think thank you can come in the form of support for all the work that you guys are doing, the organizations that you are behind. And as you spoke about Wawa as well, I think we can't just want young, diverse voices in this. We have to fund them. We have to buy their books. We have to be thinking about, other ways in which we can lend our voice and support you guys through all of this. So thank you for that work, and I call upon all of you to support these amazing multi-hyphenate activists and change makers. Thank you so much for being here.
And thank you for.
And I just want to shout out two things. So just two things that are very tangible. So Wawa and I are putting together an event in November that is a collaborative event for a BIPOC Green Job Skills Fair in Washington, D.C., and we are looking for potential sponsors who could support that. We are booking the venue like literally this week as we speak, and so if that is something you are interested in funding or helping support, please come talk to us. That would be amazing. Second thing is my company, Green Jobs Board, is hosting the Green Jobs Pavilion on Friday. It's a full-day event that we're putting on with our own budgets, because no one gave us funding for that. And anyway, so if also people want to come and support, amplify, and if you have companies or organizations, please encourage them to use the Green Jobs Board, post with us, and connect with us, because we are a POC-led climate tech company, and we need all the support and amplification we can get. Thank you.
Thank you.